You hear it everywhere, in corporate boardrooms, in political commentary, or even just casually among friends when someone gets a little too enthusiastic about a new fitness trend or a tech startup.
Right, they say, oh, they have really drunk the Kool-Aid.
Exactly, they've really drunk the Kool-Aid. It is a phrase that has become completely woven into our everyday vocabulary. It is totally detached from its origins, and it is mostly used as a punchline. But today, we are going to look at where that phrase actually comes from. And I need to warn you right up front. The reality behind those words is one of the most agonizing, profoundly misunderstood tragedies in modern history.
It really is. It is a colloquialism that masks a deeply disturbing psychological reality. And just to start with a point of historical accuracy, it wasn't even Kool-Aid.
Right, the crime scene photos show that.
Yeah, when you look at the logistical records, it was mostly a cheaper powdered drink mix called Flavor Aid. But the Kool-Aid branding stuck in the public consciousness. And over the decades, it has trivialized an event that deserves our deepest, most careful attention. The casual use of that phrase implies a sort of gullibility, a foolishness on the part of the victims. And as we're going to see today, that assumption could not be further from the truth.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We have a very specific and quite solemn mission for you today. Our goal is not to gawk at some sensationalized, cartoonish, crazy cult. That is the easy way out. That is the narrative that tabloids have pushed for years.
It is the lazy narrative.
Exactly. The hard work and the important work is understanding the why and the how. How did a movement that began with such soaring idealism, such genuine promises of equality, end in such profound darkness? We are going to unpack the psychological and social tragedy that unfolded in the jungles of South America.
To do that, we are looking at a formidable stack of primary and secondary source materials. We are going way beyond the headlines. We have historical documents and sociological analyses that trace the movement's origins in the 1950s American Midwest.
We have journalistic retrospectives, too.
Yes, including the groundbreaking 1977 expose in New West magazine that served as a massive catalyst for what happened. We are looking at declassified FBI files, diplomatic cables from the U.S. Embassy in Guyana, diaries from former members, and perhaps most chillingly, the raw audio transcripts of the FBI's Q042.
Which is infamously known as the death tape.
Right.
Here is how we are going to break this down for you over the course of this deep dive. I will be guiding you through the historical timeline. I will set the stage with the incredible political context of the 1960s and 1970s and walk you through the blow-by-blow events as they unfolded from the streets of California to a remote airstrip in the Guyanese jungle.
And my role will be to serve as your social analyst. I want to look at the behavioral conditioning, the mind control, the systemic isolation, and the pharmacological abuse that was utilized. Because the people involved were not spaced-out zombies looking for a spaceship. They were intelligent, well-meaning, socially conscious individuals.
Which is the hardest part to wrap your head around.
It is. Which brings us to the core question I want you to keep in the front of your mind throughout this entire deep dive. How does a movement that begins with the promise of a racially integrated, egalitarian utopia descend into the nightmare of a jungle massacre? How is the human mind compromised so thoroughly that survival instincts are just overridden?
Let's unpack this from the very beginning, long before anyone had ever heard of Jonestown. Long before the sunglasses and the jungle compound, we are going back to the 1950s. We are in Indianapolis, Indiana. A young, incredibly charismatic preacher named Jim Jones founds the Community Unity Church.
Which he eventually renames the People's Temple Full Gospel Church.
Right. And right out of the gate, we have to recognize how profoundly radical this church was for its time and place.
You really have to place yourself in the context of the 1950s in the American Midwest. This was an era of deep systemic segregation. The Ku Klux Klan still had a very real, very menacing presence in Indiana.
It was a dangerous time to be speaking out.
Absolutely. Neighborhoods were redlined, schools were segregated, and churches were perhaps the most segregated institutions of all. But Jim Jones was preaching a doctrine of absolute racial equality. He was heavily influenced by the Pentecostal tradition, which is known for its emotive, highly expressive worship style.
Lots of energy.
Huge energy. And he combined that with the social gospel of liberal Protestant denominations. That emphasized performing good works and addressing social injustices in the here and now, rather than just waiting for heaven.
He demanded that his congregation be fully integrated. And he don't just preach it from the pulpit. He lived it in a way that genuinely shocked and angered his white neighbors. Jim Jones and his wife, Marceline, became the first white couple in the state of Indiana to adopt a black baby. a boy they named James Jones Jr.
And the backlash to that was severe.
It was terrifying. They faced intense racist backlash for this. We are talking about anonymous phone threats in the middle of the night. Dead animals were left on their property. They received handwritten notes from people saying they were actively praying for the death of their child.
But he didn't back down.
No, he didn't. He actively fought segregation in his community. He would intentionally take black members of his congregation to white-only restaurants, sit down, and absolutely refuse to leave until they were served. He was daring the establishment to call the police.
When you analyze the early growth of the People's Temple, this activism served a brilliant dual purpose. On one hand, it provided genuine, tangible social good. It challenged a deeply unjust system, and it provided a safe haven. On the other hand, from a psychological standpoint, it allowed Jones to position himself as a fearless savior figure.
He was the protector.
Exactly. He was the white man who was willing to bleed for the black community. When you look at the demographic of who joined the People's Temple, it wasn't because they were weak-minded. It was because the temple offered something profound that mainstream American society was actively denying them. The temple offered social welfare, drug rehabilitation programs, elderly care, a free dining hall, and a powerful sense of belonging for the disenfranchised.
If you were a marginalized person in the 1950s and 60s and you were looking at the People's Temple, you saw a group that was actually doing the work. They weren't just passing a collection plate and talking about the afterlife. They were trying to build a better world right now. They were running nursing homes. They were getting people off heroin.
And that demographic reality is crucial to understand everything that follows. The sociological data we have emphasizes that the People's Temple was as much a black social movement as it was a religious one. Eventually, African Americans comprised roughly 70% of the total membership.
That is a huge majority.
It is. Many of these members were black women who had migrated from the Jim Crow South during the Great Migration. They came looking for the promised land of the North and West, only to find systemic poverty, redlining, and a different, more insidious brand of racism. The temple stepped right into that void. They offered a bridge between the radical politics of the Black Power movement and the familiar community-building aspects of the traditional black church.
That sets up a fascinating transition. In 1965, Jones starts claiming he has had prophetic visions of an imminent nuclear holocaust. He tells his congregation that Indianapolis is going to be wiped off the map, and he moves his dedicated followers to California.
They start in a rural northern town called Ukiah.
Right. He claimed he read an article saying Ukiah was one of the safest places to survive a nuclear blast due to wind patterns. Eventually, by the early 1970s, they expand massively. They establish enormous headquarters in San Francisco and Los Angeles. And this is where the specific cultural context of California in the 1970s really supercharges the movement.
The 1970s in California was an absolute crucible of social change. Think about the backdrop. The ongoing tension of the Cold War, the immediate aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement, the violent anti-Vietnam War protests, the assassinations of the 1960s, and the rise of the New Left. There was a prevailing sentiment among many activists and intellectuals known as Third Worldism.
Can you break down what Third Worldism actually meant for someone living in San Francisco at that time?
Yeah, it was essentially a political ideology that saw the struggles of marginalized people within the United States as directly linked to the anti-colonial struggles happening in the developing world. Places in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. It was a sense of global solidarity against Western imperialism and capitalism.
Yeah.
The People's Temple tapped directly into the zeitgeist.
They evolved.
They did. They weren't just a church anymore. They were presenting themselves as a vanguard for global socialist revolution. They were speaking the exact language of the progressive activists of the era.
And because of that, they became incredibly politically powerful in California. Now, it is fascinating to look at the political ledgers and historical records from that era. Regardless of where anyone sits on the political spectrum today, the historical reality is that Jones knew exactly how to leverage California's progressive politics to build a massive, untouchable shield around himself.
He was a master networker.
He really was. He overtly courted left-wing political figures. He preached a doctrine of anti-capitalism and racial equality, but more importantly, he backed it up with sheer logistical power. If a politician needed a crowd for a rally, Jones could deliver a dozen busloads of well-dressed, enthusiastic, disciplined volunteers at a moment's notice. He could mobilize massive voting blocks.
That organizational power, that ability to put boots on the ground, is what made the People's Temple so incredibly attractive to the political establishment. Politicians deal in the currency of votes and optics. And Jim Jones was a billionaire in that regard. Because the temple could mobilize so effectively, Jones earned the admiration, the defense, and the endorsement of very prominent figures.
The historical archives show letters of support and shared stages with left-wing icons like Angela Davis and San Francisco supervisor Harvey Milk.
Yes, the temple forged strategic relationships with progressive churches, radical groups like the Black Panthers, and even the Nation of Islam. The political establishment rewarded him. Jim Jones was even appointed as the chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission. He had a taxpayer-funded office, a staff, and real institutional power.
He was a legitimate kingmaker in San Francisco politics. Mayors, governors, state assemblymen, they all came to his services, sat in the front row, and praised his humanitarian work. But while the People's Temple is putting on this highly polished public face of a progressive, politically engaged humanitarian organization behind closed doors, a very different, deeply unsettling reality is taking shape.
This is where things start to turn.
Jim Jones is slowly transforming from a charismatic, inclusive preacher into a paranoid, megalomaniacal dictator.
That transformation is the psychological core of this tragedy. To understand how he corrupted this utopian promise, we have to look at a concept Jones internally called apostolic socialism. The source documents, including internal memos and recordings of his closed-door meetings, reveal that Jones actually deeply resented traditional Christianity.
Which is wild for a pastor.
It is. He viewed the concept of a loving interventionist God as a tool used by the ruling class to oppress minorities and the poor, keeping them docile. He privately admitted to his inner circle that he was an atheist and a Marxist. He stated explicitly that he only used religion as an opiate. That's a very deliberate twist on Karl Marx's famous phrase about religion being the opiate of the masses.
So it was a Trojan horse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Jones used it to make his radical socialist ideology palatable to a demographic that was deeply rooted in the church.
He used the church structure because it was tax-exempt, it commanded instant cultural authority, and it provided a captive audience. He slowly started dismantling their traditional faith. During sermons, he started telling his followers that the traditional view of a sky god was a lie. He would ask why a loving God would allow black children to starve or be lynched.
He was breaking down their core beliefs.
And in one infamous moment, he physically threw a King James Bible on the floor, spit on it, and told the congregation, that book is a lie. And then he took the ultimate leap of megalomania. Having torn down their God, he inserted himself. He started claiming that he was the reincarnation of figures like Jesus Christ, Buddha, and Vladimir Lenin. He essentially claimed to be the only God that mattered, a physical, living God who could actually provide for them.
But if you're going to claim to be God, you have to provide miracles. And to prove his divinity, he orchestrated incredibly elaborate theatrical deceptions. The historical accounts of his faith healings are astonishing. He would have his aides dig through the trash of congregants to find out their personal secrets, which he would then prophesy from the pulpit to prove he was omniscient.
It's just simple con artistry at that point.
It is. But the most grotesque deception involved the physical healings. He would have his inner circle procure animal parts, specifically rancid chicken livers. During a service, a plant in the audience, or sometimes a genuine believer who thought they were sick, would come forward. Jones would perform a dramatic healing, reaching into their throat or under their clothing, and he would produce this bloody chicken liver, claiming it was a cancerous tumor that he had miraculously pulled from their body.
So walk me through the logistics of that. If you are an intelligent person sitting in the pews, or if you are one of the aides buying the chicken livers, how is no one raising their hand and saying this is a scam? If you see a woman supposedly dying of cancer suddenly cured, and there's physical evidence of the tumor being expelled, how does the deception hold up?
For the general congregation, you have to factor in the sheer theatricality of it. The lighting, the swelling gospel music, the exhaustion of the long services, the intense peer pressure of thousands of people screaming in jubilation. They wanted to believe. But for the inner circle, the aides who were literally buying the chicken livers, the psychology is even more fascinating and dark. Participating in that deception bound those high-ranking members to Jones.
Because they are complicit now.
Yes. It created a shared dark secret. This brings in the concept of cognitive dissonance. They knew it was fake, but they had committed their entire lives to this socialist utopia. They convinced themselves that the ends, building an egalitarian society, feeding the poor, justified the fraudulent, manipulative means. They told themselves, Father has to do these tricks to keep the masses engaged, but the broader mission is pure. But once you compromise your morality for a leader, You were trapped.
And that raises the most critical question. How do you keep people from leaving once the demands become extreme? Because he didn't just ask them to attend Sunday service, he built an architecture of total control.
Exactly. This is where we see the application of milieu control. That's a term coined by psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton to describe the control of human communication and a person's entire environment. Ask yourself, how do you slowly strip away a person's identity? It doesn't happen overnight. If Jones had asked for everything on day one, everyone would have walked out. It was a gradual, insidious grooming process.
Boiling the frog?
Precisely. First, you ask them to devote more time to the church, maybe volunteer for an extra committee. Then you ask for a larger tithe. Then you ask them to turn over their personal wealth, their savings, the deeds to their property. You have elderly members signing over their monthly welfare or Social Security checks directly to the temple, effectively making them entirely financially dependent on Jones for their survival.
Then comes the social isolation. You convince them that the outside world is not just flawed, but actively hostile, racist, and fascist. Jones would tell them that the CIA and the KKK were plotting against the temple. He demanded that members sever ties with any family members who questioned the church, labeling those outsiders as treasonous.
And coupled with financial and social isolation is profound physical exhaustion. He enforced severe sleep deprivation. Members were required to work their normal day jobs, but then they were forced to attend temple meetings and sermons that lasted deep into the night, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning. They would sleep for a few hours, then go back to work.
That destroys your ability to think clearly.
Entirely. From a neurological standpoint, when a human being is chronically sleep-deprived, their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for critical thinking, logic, and evaluating risk, essentially shuts down. They lose their internal compass, they become highly suggestible, and they look entirely to the group and leader for cues on how to behave.
And if someone did step out of line, if they showed a moment of clarity or resistance, the punishments were brutal. When you look at the diaries of former members, you read about these terrifying catharsis sessions. If you were perceived as disloyal, if you questioned a teaching, or even if you just complained about being tired, you were brought before the entire congregation of hundreds of people. You were publicly humiliated. Members were encouraged to scream at you.
And then it escalated to physical violence.
Adults and children alike were beaten with heavy wooden paddles called the Board of Education. People were forced to engage in boxing matches against larger, stronger members until they were beaten bloody.
It was coercive persuasion designed to break the human spirit. But perhaps the most insidious, cold-blooded tool of control was the weaponization of guilt and blackmail. Members were forced to sign blank pieces of paper or write out false confessions. The sociological records note that members were made to write testimonials claiming they had engaged in terroristic acts, that they planned to assassinate the president, or, horrifically, that they had molested their own children.
Oh, that is evil.
The temple's legal and security teams kept these false confessions meticulously on file. It was a perfectly designed psychological trap. If you ever woke up from the sleep deprivation and thought about leaving, you knew they had a document, signed in your own handwriting, that could destroy your life, send you to federal prison, or ensure your children were taken away by the state.
They were systematically dismantling these people's ability to exist outside the temple. But a secret that large, involving thousands of people, cannot be kept forever. As the physical and financial abuses escalated in California, word started to leak out. A few brave defectors managed to escape the psychological hold and began talking to the press. And that brings us to the summer of 1977, which is the massive turning point in this timeline.
The breaking point.
An investigative magazine in California called New West was preparing to publish a massive, heavily researched exposé written by journalists Marshall Kilduff and Phil Tracy. This article, titled Inside People's Temple, was going to blow the lid off everything. It detailed the fake healings, the physical beatings, the public humiliations, and the massive financial extortion.
Jim Jones knew the article was coming. He tried to use his political connections to kill the story, flooding the magazine's offices with thousands of phone calls and letters from politicians. But the editors held firm. And Jones's paranoia, which was now being heavily fueled by a massive addiction to prescription amphetamines and barbiturates, went into absolute overdrive.
He was terrified.
He was terrified of government intervention. He knew that if law enforcement investigated the finances and the beatings, he would go to prison. He was terrified of losing his godlike power, of being exposed to his followers as a fraud. He needed a place where the American press, the IRS, and the U.S. government couldn't reach him.
So he triggers the exodus. The People's Temple had already leased a remote 3,800-acre tract of dense jungle land in the South American nation of Guyana a few years prior. Initially, it was just a small agricultural outpost run by a few dozen members. But in August 1977, right as the New West article hits the newsstands, Jones orders a mass, frantic migration. Nearly 1,000 Americans pack up their entire lives, board chartered flights, and follow him into the Guyanese wilderness to a settlement they dubbed the People's Temple Agricultural Project, which everyone just called Jonestown.
Jones sold Jonestown to his followers as the ultimate promised land. He pitched it as a socialist paradise, utterly free from the racism, sexism, and violent capitalism of the United States, a place where they could farm the land, build their own society, and finally live in peace and harmony. And the choice of Guyana was strategic. It was an English-speaking country, it had a large black population, and its government at the time, led by Prime Minister Forbes Burnham, espoused cooperative socialist ideals. This meant the Guyanese government was ideologically sympathetic to Jones and, frankly, willing to look the other way in exchange for the temple's public support and agricultural development.
But the reality of this promised land was a living nightmare. When you picture Jonestown, do not picture a lush Caribbean resort. This was deep, unforgiving jungle. The soil was incredibly thin, highly acidic, and terrible for the kind of farming they were trying to do. The climate was oppressive, relentless, sweltering heat and suffocating humidity.
The physical toll must have been unimaginable.
The members, from the elderly to young children, were forced to work brutal manual labor, clearing jungle and planting crops for 11 to 18 hours a day, and their diet. Because the crops failed and Jones hoarded the wealth in overseas bank accounts, they survived on meager, starvation-level rations of rice, beans, and peanut butter. People were losing dozens of pounds. They were plagued by tropical diseases, severe diarrhea, and chronic exhaustion.
What we are looking at when we examine the layout and operation of Jonestown is the establishment of a total totalitarian environment. It was a prison camp disguised as a commune. First, there was absolute physical isolation. There were no paved roads out of the jungle. The nearest town, Port Kaituma, was miles away, accessible only by a muddy track or boat. When members arrived at the compound, their passports and whatever remaining American money they had were immediately confiscated.
You literally cannot leave.
They were legally and physically trapped in a foreign country. And Jones enforced his rule with a group of heavily armed guards known as the Red Brigade. These were his most loyal zealots who patrolled the perimeter of the compound with shotguns, rifles, and crossbows. Officially, they were there to keep the fascists out, but everyone knew they were there to keep the members in.
And if you dissented in Jonestown, there was nowhere to hide, no police to call. The diplomatic cables and survivor accounts detail terrifying punishments. If someone complained about the food or expressed a desire to go home, they were subjected to medical abuse. The temple operated what they called an extended care unit. It was essentially a psychiatric prison. Dissidents were heavily drugged with massive doses of sedatives like thorazine and sodium pentothal.
Let's pause and look at what that actually means. Thorazine is a heavy first-generation antipsychotic. When used abusively in these doses, it acts as a chemical straitjacket. It removes a person's motor control and blunts their emotional affect. Sodium pentothal is a barbiturate, often called truth serum, used to lower inhibitions and force confessions. They were using pharmacology to ensure total compliance.
And if the drugs didn't work?
If the drugs didn't work, physical torture was utilized. People were thrown into a 6x4 plywood box left out in the baking tropical sun for days, or they were taken to the torture hole, a dark, muddy well where they were lowered upside down in the middle of the night.
This atmosphere of dread was intentionally and meticulously cultivated by Jones. He had a PA system with loudspeakers installed all over the compound, in every building and dormitory. He would broadcast his rambling, drug-fueled monologues, reading distorted news about how America was collapsing into race wars on a constant loop, day and night. The sleep deprivation transitioned from a tactic into a permanent state of being. A former member later explicitly stated that Jones knew keeping people poor, starving, and exhausted meant they couldn't physically or mentally formulate plans to escape.
But the psychological conditioning went even further, reaching its most sinister peak with something Jones called the White Nights. I want you to imagine you are living in this jungle camp. You are starving. You haven't slept a full night in months. You are thousands of miles from home. Suddenly, at 2 in the morning, loud, piercing sirens start blaring across the compound.
Jones would get on the megaphone and announce a state of absolute existential emergency. He would claim that the compound was surrounded by Guyanese military, or mercenaries hired by the CIA, who were parachuting in through the canopy. he would order the entire community, men, women, and children, to immediately gather at the central open-air pavilion. And when they arrived, in the dark, they would be surrounded by the armed guards of the Red Brigade.
And then, standing on his raised chair, he would present them with a horrific narrative choice. He would tell them that the invasion was imminent, that the mercenaries were going to torture the adults and horrifically abuse and kill their children. He told them that the only dignified response, the only way to protest this fascist world on their own terms, was revolutionary suicide. During these white nights, they actually ran suicide drills. Members, including the children, were forced to line up and drink a small cup of red liquid that Jones explicitly told them was poison.
The accounts of these drills are heartbreaking. People were told they would die within 45 minutes. They sat there in the dark, weeping, holding their children, waiting for the convulsions to start, waiting for death. And then, after an agonizing hour, Jones would announce that it was merely a loyalty test, that there was no poison in the cups.
This is a textbook, terrifying application of the boiling frog effect. By repeatedly simulating the trauma of mass suicide, by forcing them to confront their own death over and over, Jones was normalizing the unthinkable. He was systematically eroding their psychological will to resist. The physical ritual of lining up, taking a cup, and drinking what they believed was poison became an ingrained muscle memory habit. He was conditioning them to obey the ultimate command without question, so that if the real order ever came, the psychological barrier to taking that fatal action had already been broken down through repetition.
It is just staggering to comprehend the level of psychological warfare being waged against his own people. While this nightmare is unfolding in the Guyanese jungle back in the United States, alarm bells are ringing louder and louder. Family members who had lost contact with their loved ones or who received strange, clearly censored letters praising Jonestown in robotic language banded together. They formed a vocal advocacy group called the Concerned Relatives. They held press conferences, they protested, and they relentlessly lobbied the U.S. State Department and Congress to intervene.
And their persistence finally broke through the bureaucratic indifference. California Congressman Leo Ryan, a Democrat who had several constituents trapped in Jonestown, agreed to lead a formal congressional fact-finding mission. Congressman Ryan was a unique political figure. He was known for his highly unorthodox, hands-on approach to investigations. He wasn't the kind of politician to just read a State Department report from his desk.
He went to the source.
Yes. In the past, he had gone undercover as a teacher to investigate inner-city schools, and he had spent time locked in Folsom Prison to understand prison conditions. He wanted to see the Jonestown commune with his own eyes, speak to the people, and bring home any American citizen who wanted to leave.
So in November 1978, a delegation embarks for Guyana. It is a substantial group. You have Congressman Ryan, his young legal aide, Jackie Spire, a group of aggressive, high-profile journalists, including an NBC News crew with correspondent Don Harris, producer Bob Flick, soundman Steve Sung, and cameraman Bob Brown. There are reporters from the Washington Post and the San Francisco Examiner, and there are several representatives from the Concerned Relatives group who have flown down hoping to physically pull their children or siblings out of the jungle.
Jim Jones and his legal team in Georgetown initially tried desperately to block the delegation from entering Jonestown. They claimed it was private property, they cited sovereignty issues, but Ryan was insistent. He effectively told them he was coming in with or without their permission. Finally, on November 17th, the delegation was allowed to fly into the Port Kaituma airstrip and travel the muddy road into the compound.
And at first, Jonestown put on a show.
True to form, Jonestown put on a highly orchestrated theatrical happy face. They served a decent dinner featuring pork, which the members hadn't eaten in months. The commune's R&B band, the Jonestown Express, played upbeat music. Members were instructed to smile, dance, and tell the reporters how happy they were. It was a carefully constructed Potemkin Village illusion designed to convince the politicians and the press that Jonestown was exactly what it claimed to be, a thriving, peaceful, utopian commune.
But the cracks in the facade appeared almost immediately. While the music is playing and the cameras are rolling, brave members are taking terrifying risks. They are secretly slipping crumpled notes to the journalists. One note, handed to NBC's Don Harris, simply said, "Please help us get out. We are being held prisoner." Imagine the tension in the air. It must have been suffocating. The journalists realize they are not in a commune. They are in a hostage situation.
By the morning of November 18th, the illusion shattered completely. Congressman Ryan sat down in the main pavilion to conduct interviews, and the floodgates opened. People who had been terrified into silence for years saw the cameras, saw a U.S. congressman, and they made their move. They started coming forward, risking their lives, begging to leave with the congressional delegation.
Families were literally splitting apart right there.
Families were being torn apart in real time, with husbands wanting to leave and wives wanting to stay. Jones was visibly deteriorating. He was sweating profusely, slurring his words from the drugs, pleading with people not to go. To a malignant narcissist like Jones, these defections were not just a logistical loss of control. They were a profound personal betrayal and a blazing signal that his absolute power, his entire empire, was collapsing.
It all boils over that afternoon. The delegation is frantically preparing to leave, having gathered about 16 temple defectors who are desperate to get out. As Ryan is finalizing things in the pavilion, violence erupts. A temple member named Don Sly, acting on his own or under orders, lunges at Congressman Ryan with a hunting knife, attempting to slit his throat.
And he almost succeeded.
The knife is wrestled away by Ryan's lawyers and other members, and Ryan's shirt is covered in the attacker's blood. But miraculously, the congressman himself is unhurt. However, the message is chillingly clear. The situation is incredibly volatile, the illusion of peace is dead, and they need to evacuate immediately.
The entire group, the politicians, the press, and the defectors, boards a large dump truck. They make the incredibly tense, muddy 6-mile journey back to the Port Kaituma airstrip. They're looking over their shoulders the entire time. They arrive at the dirt runway, waiting for 2 small charter planes to arrive from Georgetown to fly them to safety. But the logistical delay at the airstrip, waiting for the planes to land and taxi, proves fatal.
The planes finally arrive, a larger Twin Otter and a smaller 6-seat Cessna. They start frantically boarding the defectors and the journalists, trying to figure out weight limits and who goes on which plane. But then a tractor pulling a flatbed trailer drives up to the edge of the dirt airstrip. Standing on the trailer are members of Jonestown's heavily armed Red Brigade, carrying rifles and shotguns.
Without a single word of warning, they opened fire on the airplanes and the crowd. It wasn't a random, chaotic shooting. It was a coordinated, targeted assassination. They aimed specifically for the congressman, the defectors, and the journalists with cameras.
The details from the witness testimonies and the recovered footage are just harrowing. NBC cameraman Bob Brown, a seasoned combat veteran, realizes what is happening. Instead of running, he hoists his heavy camera onto his shoulder and keeps it rolling. He captured the first few seconds of the ambush, documenting the gunman advancing from the tractor before he was shot in the leg, fell to the ground, and was fatally shot in the head.
He documented his own death.
Congressman Leo Ryan is gunned down near the nose of the plane. The assassins walk up and shoot his body over 20 times at close range to ensure he is dead. He remains the only U.S. congressman to be assassinated in the line of duty.
Don Harris, the NBC reporter who received the secret note, is killed. Greg Robinson, a photographer for the San Francisco Examiner, is killed. Patricia Parks, a Temple member who was defecting with her family, has her head blown off as she sits inside the Twin Otter. 11 others are severely wounded.
Including Jackie Speier?
Yes. Ryan's aide, Jackie Speier, is shot 5 times, lying bleeding in the dirt near the landing gear. She would survive by playing dead and would remarkably go on to serve in Congress herself decades later. The survivors only made it by dragging their bleeding bodies into the dense jungle bordering the airstrip, hiding in the brush as the gunmen searched for them.
And the terror wasn't just happening on the tarmac. Inside the smaller Cessna plane, a man named Larry Layton, who had pretended to be a defector specifically to infiltrate the group, pulls out a smuggled revolver. He turns and starts shooting the actual defectors inside the confined cabin at point-blank range, severely wounding 2 people before the gun jams, and he is physically wrestled to the floor and disarmed.
The Red Brigade gunmen, believing they have killed the primary targets, eventually pile back onto their tractor and drive the 6 miles back to Jonestown. Let's look at the geopolitical reality of that moment. They have just executed a sitting U.S. congressman. They have murdered members of the American press. The Rubicon has been crossed, the point of no return has been reached, and Jim Jones knows it.
We are now at the late afternoon of November 18th, 1978. Back at the Jonestown compound, Jones receives word via radio that the airstrip ambush was successful, but that some people survived and fled into the jungle. He knows that within hours, the Guyanese military or U.S. Special Forces will descend on Jonestown in full combat gear. He triggers the final catastrophic white knight. He orders the sirens sounded. He calls every single member of the community, over 900 people, men, women, and infants, to assemble immediately at the main pavilion.
And this brings us to one of the most chilling, historically significant pieces of evidence in existence. The FBI's Q042, widely known as the death tape. It is a raw, 44-minute audio recording of this final assembly. Jones routinely recorded his sermons, and he recorded this. Captures the psychological manipulation, the coercion, the sheer horror, and the dying breaths of hundreds of people.
It is deeply disturbing to listen to.
It is, and I want to be extremely clear about what a forensic analysis of this paper reveals, because it corrects a massive historical misconception. This was not a peaceful, unified mass suicide. For hundreds of people, particularly the children and the dissenters, this was a mass murder.
When we listen to the raw audio of Q0422, how does Jones orchestrate this? He starts by speaking to the crowd, and he tells them a lie. He tells them that the congressman has been murdered, which is true, but he claims he didn't order it, that it was an act of rogue zealots. Then he spins a terrifying calculated fiction. He tells his followers that because of the assassination of a U.S. official, military forces are going to parachute into the jungle compound at any moment. He tells them these soldiers will butcher the adults. He tells them they will torture their children, that they will parachute in and shoot their babies. He tells them they will torture the seniors.
He creates a claustrophobic psychological scenario where a horrific, agonizing death by military torture is imminent and unavoidable. It is the ultimate culmination of his years of paranoia. He tells them that the only option left to maintain their dignity, the only way to protest this inhumane world, is to commit what he calls revolutionary suicide. He frames it not as giving up, not as a defeat, but as a final, glorious political act of defiance against capitalism and fascism.
But the people didn't just blindly, silently accept this. The tape captures a moment of incredible heroism. A 60-year-old woman named Christine Miller stands up in front of the entire assembly, surrounded by armed guards, and bravely dissents. She argues with Jones, and her voice is captured clearly on the tape. She says, "Is it too late for Russia?"
She was offering an alternative.
She argues that they should attempt an airlift to the Soviet Union, which Jones had previously floated as a backup plan. She says, "As long as there is life, there is hope. That is my faith." She is actively fighting for the lives of the 900 people there.
Christine Miller's resistance is profound, and it is crucial to the historical record. It proves that the mind control, despite years of abuse, was not absolute. People still wanted to live. But listen to how Jones systematically shuts her down. He uses his authority. He calmly argues that Russia won't take them now that they have assassinated a U.S. official. But the truly terrifying part is how the crowd reacts.
The crowd turns on her.
Exactly. Conditioned by years of groupthink, terrified of the armed guards surrounding the pavilion, and deeply manipulated by the fear of the impending military invasion Jones promised, the crowd turns against Miller. They begin shouting her down. They yell at her to sit down, to stop disrespecting father. The milieu control takes over. And when Jones receives final, confirmed radio transmission that Congressman Ryan is dead, he announces it to the crowd and all debate ends. He tells them, there's no way out.
At his command, aides bring out a large metal vat originally used for cooking soup. Inside this vat is a lethal mixture. It contains grape-flavored Flavor Aid, massive lethal doses of potassium cyanide, and a cocktail of liquid tranquilizers and sedatives like Valium, Phenergan, and chloral hydrate designed to numb the panic. And then the most incomprehensible, evil part of this tragedy begins. Jones orders that the children be poisoned first.
Over 300 miners died in Jonestown. 1/3 of the victims were children. They legally and morally could not consent to suicide. This was an act of mass murder. The logistical reality is horrifying. Parents and temple nurses used plastic medical syringes with the needles removed to draw up the cyanide mixture, and they squirted it directly into the backs of the mouths of babies, toddlers, and young children.
You can hear this on the tape.
On the Q042 tape, beneath the sound of Jones talking, you can hear the undeniable escalating sounds of children crying, coughing, and screaming in pain as the poison takes effect. Potassium cyanide poisoning is not a gentle, peaceful slipping away. It deprives the body's cells of oxygen. It causes excruciating, violent muscle convulsions, foaming at the mouth, and painful suffocation. It takes several minutes of agony to die.
And as the children are dying, as the screams are echoing under the tin roof of the pavilion, Jones is on the microphone and he sounds irritated. He tells the adults to stop these hysterics. He chastises them, saying, "This is not the way for people who are socialists or communists to die. Die with a degree of dignity." He actively lies to the parents, telling them that the children aren't crying from pain, just that the mixture tastes a little bitter. He is coldly managing the optics and the audio recording of a massacre as it happens.
Once the children were dead or dying, the adults were ordered to drink from small paper cups. And again, we must emphasize that this was an environment of extreme lethal coercion. The pavilion was entirely surrounded by the Red Brigade, standing shoulder to shoulder, armed with guns and crossbows. The choice presented to the adults was to drink the poison or be shot to death. and the physical evidence proves that not everyone drank willingly.
The autopsy showed that.
When the Guyanese chief medical examiner, Dr. Leslie Mutu, examined the bodies later, he found fresh needle puncture marks on the backs of the shoulders and upper arms of numerous bodies. This indicates that those who physically resisted, who refused to drink, were tackled, held down, and forcibly injected with cyanide against their will.
Amidst the chaos, a few people miraculously managed to survive. Some realized what was happening early on and managed to slip past the guards and vanish into the dense jungle while the assembly was still gathering. One man, Grover Davis, simply hid in a ditch near the edge of the compound and waited. An elderly woman named Hyacinth Thrash, who had mobility and hearing problems, hid under her bed in her dormitory, slept through the entire horrific ordeal, and woke up the next morning to walk out and find everyone dead.
And there's the basketball team.
Right. The Jonestown basketball team happened to be in the capital city of Georgetown for a tournament. Though tragically, Jones had radioed the revolutionary suicide orders to the temple's headquarters in Georgetown as well, resulting in a devoted temple member named Sharon Amos taking a kitchen knife into a bathroom and slitting the throats of her 3 children before killing herself while the police were literally knocking on the front door.
Back at the Jonestown Pavilion, the voices on the tape slowly fade out. Speeches praising Jones, declaring him the greatest man who ever lived, are given by a few hardcore zealots as people convulse and die in the mud around them. The music plays. And then, the last sounds on the 44-minute tape are the eerie, profound silence settling over the jungle, punctuated only by a few birds and Jones's final, defiant, slurred words claiming they didn't commit suicide, but an act of revolutionary suicide protesting the conditions of an inhumane world. And then the tape clicks off.
When the Guyanese troops and eventually the U.S. military finally arrive the next morning, they are met with a vista that completely defies human comprehension. It is a carpet of bodies, a sea of bright clothing against the mud, frozen in time. Many died with their arms wrapped around each other, families huddling together in their final moments. In total, 918 lives were lost on November 18, 1978.
909 people in Jonestown.
5 at the Port Kaituma airstrip and 4 at the temple headquarters in Georgetown. Jim Jones himself was found dead on the stage of the pavilion, resting on a pillow, with a single gunshot wound to the head. It is still debated by historians whether he pulled the trigger himself or ordered one of his bodyguards to do it, but the ultimate cowardly irony is that he avoided the agonizing cyanide death he forced upon his hundreds of followers.
The scale of the loss is simply staggering to process. Until the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, the Jonestown massacre represented the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act in the nation's history. And the legacy of Jonestown has fundamentally altered our world. It changed the way law enforcement handles hostage situations. It completely reshaped how sociologists, psychiatrists, and the general public view high-control groups and cults.
It shattered our previous understanding.
It proved, in the most horrific, undeniable way possible, that the systematic application of social isolation, sleep deprivation, milieu control, and extreme psychological conditioning can actually override the most fundamental, hardwired biological drive in the human animal, the instinct for survival.
And it left us with that terrible, flippant phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid. A phrase that mocks the victims by implying they were simply foolish, gullible, or crazy. But as we have seen today, that couldn't be further from the truth. We have to restore the humanity to those 918 people. These were not spaced-out caricatures wearing robes. They were idealistic people. They were largely marginalized African Americans, elderly folks, and young families who were desperately searching for a better, more equitable world. They were looking for a place where they belonged, where they were safe from the systemic injustices, the racism, and the poverty of the 1960s and 70s.
Their desire for a better world was a beautiful, noble thing. It was their ultimate tragedy that they placed their faith, their money, and their lives in the hands of a man who weaponized that very hope against them. Jim Jones didn't build a utopia. He built a psychological and physical prison constructed out of their own idealism. He identified their deepest vulnerabilities, their deepest desires for equality, and he exploited them for his own insatiable, narcissistic need for total power.
It is a heavy, heavy history to carry and an incredibly difficult narrative to walk through. But understanding the mechanics of how it happened, looking unflinchingly at the history, is the only way we honor those who were lost and ensure their story isn't reduced to a punchline.
Which leaves us with an incredibly difficult but absolutely necessary question to ponder as we close. We spend so much time in our society analyzing the red flags of charismatic leaders. We study the warning signs of the narcissists, the sociopaths, and the manipulators who demand absolute obedience. But Jim Jones only succeeded in the beginning because he identified and exploited a very real, very deep human yearning for community, for purpose, and for equality that mainstream society was failing to revive. So the question isn't just how do we spot the next Jim Jones? The question is, how do we build societies, neighborhoods, and systems where people feel so deeply seen, so valued, and so fundamentally safe that the utopian promises of a charlatan lose their magnetic pull entirely?